What led me to today was 2 years ago in October. I did the Walmesleys of Westwood House, and I don't know if anybody in the room remembers that night. It's quite busy. So I want to try and avoid some confusion before I start tonight. The Walmesleys of Hall of Ince and the Westwood House were separated by about half a mile, and their estates literally adjoined each other. I think they were related. They're a grand old Lancashire family married into different other big families as well. But it's still unfortunately a work in progress. So there is quite a number of coincidences in the timelines of Wigan where they both seem to be very, very close together. But yeah, I haven't found much evidence of that. So if you could please just treat this family as maybe related to the ones at Westwood Walmesley, but please don't assume that it is of the same. And first of all, the halls of Ince, let me clarify. Ince Hall, Old Hall, New Hall, Hall of Ince. Which is which? Belting question. Put simply, this is a statement that I picked up and it absolutely drives home the confusion. So the Ince halls will necessarily lead to some confusion in any attempt to locate any particular occupant in past times. Wigan Observer, 16th of August, 1919. So little old me, 105 years later, is going to try and attach the correct residents to the correct halls of Ince. I've got 4 of them. I'm not counting Peel or Kirklees or anything, strictly ones that was basically called any of those 4 previous names or titles. So the first one, which will ring straight away true with Liz, who lives practically next door to the only surviving Ince Hall left in Ince, is the one off Ince Hall Avenue off Manchester Road. And the star is just the front lawn and the turning circle, but hold on, I'm getting a bit too keen. That's the actual hall itself. Just looking there with a couple of outbuildings at the back. Anybody remember Turner's Butchers? Good. They still own the building. And I think they might have moved in the 60s and they've made quite a lot of interior changes, but we'll go on to that somewhat in detail just in some short time. So the earliest of the maps, as you can see, got this big long drive, turning circle, and going up to the hall. It's not all that far from the canal. And Peel Hall itself, it dates to something like 14 something. It's literally just over the bridge. 1908, same sort of situation. This big long drive. It was actually described as having a fine avenue of elms, and there's some beautiful photographs or artist impressions that are coming up soon. So there's the hall again, and there's just some of those outbuildings as well. Let's get used to this thing a little better. And this is a bit more clarity. So again, the turning circle. The drive's been shortened somewhat by 1929, but it's labelled as Ince Hall. And there it is once again with its outbuildings. By 1951, still in the same situation. Peel Hall Bridge, the canal, not a great amount has changed. But when you have a look at what it used to look like, now, this is a sketch by a well-known fellow called Captain Latham, who actually went around Lancashire specialising in these old manor houses. Now, as you can see, this is quite elaborate. And I did mention those fine avenue of elms, which you can just see on the left and on the right as well. So it's a beautiful sketch. It does change, by the way. And this was sent to me quite recently again. The same sketch. I'm not entirely sure on the artist, but just got people there just having a little bit of a picnic. Somebody on horseback just arriving into the frame, and somebody with a hat on there as well. Potentially the person that was living there. And this is another shot. This is now the difference between Latham and Whitehouse. Whitehouse did watercolours, and he used quite a bit of artistic license to go with it as well. So as you can see, the drive's not straight for a start. And it's just it just differs ever so slightly, but it's an important and valuable record. Now, Wigan and Lee, as I've mentioned up here, have the original manuscript dated in 1829. So Whitehouse, kept on adding different buildings to his manuscript. So if you ever wanted to go and have a look at the original drawings, then the Wigan and Lee archives. I believe it was built by a fellow called Brown in 1601, and it may well have formed part of the adjacent Peel Hall estate. You know, the Peel Hall was there for quite some time before this, maybe 250 years previous to when this place was actually built. And at some point, it actually became home of the Holt family. Now, if you think of Sir Robert Holt Lee, a bit of a name in Wigan's history, particularly with the canals and stuff. He had a bit of a shady lifestyle, let's say, which I'm going to mention in a little bit. So one of the former residents of this beautiful house was an Ince lad called Hodgson. He was MP for 11 years between 1820 and 1831. His father was also from Ince, who served as Mayor of Wigan on 3 different occasions. Now, the Hodgsons weren't too pleased with what they called the established aristocratic interests of the MPs and stuff. So back then, it was always your landed gentry, more often than not, who would go and stand as MP. Hodgson was a mill owner, and he said, well, hold on a minute. I went to private school. I run my own business. It's successful. What about me? So he was one of the leading lights in saying, you know, we want a piece of this pie as well. Now, people might like folklore and stuff, but I don't. I think half of it's a load of rubbish. But there is something I'm going to be talking about now. Has anybody ever heard of the tale about Kitty Bout Yed from Ince? Right. If you're not from Lancashire, Sean, it basically means woman without head. Something like that. And according to Roby, in 1929, he discusses this story. No names, no nothing. But anyway, it's an interesting tale in which one of its early possessors lay on his deathbed, and a lawyer was sent for in the last moment to make his will. But before he reached the hall, the man was dead. He was determined to try the effect of the dead man's hand, Edmund Arrowsmith, on the corpse, and the attorney's clerk was sent for one at Bryn Hall in all haste, Bryn Hall being the home of the Gerards. The body of the dead man was rubbed with the holy hand, and it was asserted that he was revived enough to sign his own will. You can see where it's going, can't you? Straight away. After the funeral, a daughter of the deceased produced a will, which was not signed, leaving the property to the son and daughter. But the lawyer soon produced another will signed by the dead hand, which conveyed all the property to himself. Of course it did. So the son had a bit of a quarrel. I can see it being a bit of a sword fight of some sort of description. And after wounding him, supposed mortally, he left the country and was never heard of more. That's the son, by the way. The daughter also disappeared, but no one knew how or when. Again, there's no names, there's no real dates and times of place. However, after many years, a gardener turned up a skull in the grounds of the property, and the secret was revealed. When this took place, the hall had long since been uninhabited, for the murdered daughter's ghost hung suspended in the air before the dishonest lawyer, wherever he went. So make of it what you will. You know what my opinion is on that. And there's if you read the Lancashire Archive magazine, the first one was produced a couple of months ago. There's a fantastic article in there describing this rally at the Deepdale Stadium in Preston, led by the Diocese of Lancaster in support of canonisation, which is basically your Edmund Arrowsmith, your Thomas Moores, your John Fisher back in the day. And obviously Edmund Arrowsmith met quite a horrible end, but yet the Catholic Gerards somehow got hold of his hand. If you want to go and have a look at this, just look to St Oswald's in Ashton, and it is up there on the altar up there. In the end, Edmund was canonised in 1970 as one of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales by Pope Paul VI. You know, we've had a few schools in Wigan, haven't we? Tommy Moore, Arrowsmith, and stuff like that. John Fisher, that's being rebuilt at the moment. Now, this is interesting because it's a new development as from Saturday just gone. Because Jim Meehan, my friend and expert colleague, reckons the hall that we've just been looking at, this is from the rear, from behind. So anyone from Ince who's aware of Stirling Avenue will be around this direction. The pithead gear that you see belongs to Rosebridge Colliery. So we've had a look at the maps. It all lines up, albeit the colliery was never that close to the house. So I don't know why Skelton decided to sort of pick this this vista rather than just going round the front. But maybe it's because Latham had already done it and Whitehead had already done it. Who knows? But this, if you want to see this, by the way, it's part of the Wigan Arts and Heritage Service, or the museum archives, call it what you will. We've got some fantastic old oil paintings. We really should be showing them off. So I've described this as pre-1854 fire. So if you could just take note of these urns or vases just on either side, because unfortunately, after the fire, that was what it's rebuilt as. Very different. One was very, very English. This one is just typical Victorian red brick and what have you. But again, thanks to Liz, me and Jim went round the rear and we had a look, and we reckon the back end of it is still 1601, but it's been heavily rendered, so you can't really see anything of any architectural significance that survived. And this is off Wigan World in its better days when the Turner family were living there. And I mentioned they made quite a few alterations. They certainly did that on the inside. I think it was all right, Liz. It's been partition. It was divided into different. Yeah. 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 So there's some form of partitioning going on when the Turners had it. So it changed a lot of the internal. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 So it was partitioned off by the Turners at that point. So and had just different residents in different parts of the hall. Now this was from Saturday Gone, and this is the current state of the hall. Thankfully it's still occupied. Don't want anybody untoward going up there and having a look. So there are people still living there. And again, it's just completely overgrown. It's not being very well looked after. But remember when I mentioned those vases at either side? Well, that's one of them. So you're going back to, well, it was on the early Latham sketches in the 1820s. So they're going to date quite a pretty amount of time. 1601, I'm not quite sure. 1601 at the back. But it doesn't look very original. So I believe once all this was rendered at the rear, and remember the skeleton version from 1836 showing a couple of the gables, it's my belief that when they've rendered these, they've just stuck a bit of a date on there just to remember the original building being still there at the back end. And one of the outbuildings also has the date on it as well. So there's some old stuff around there. It's not a listed building either. Gone the wrong way. And just some of the residents that once lived there. So it was the Gerards of Bryn who had interest in all four of these properties. And it's described as a picturesque black and white front of 5 gables, originally surrounded by a moat and approached by a fine avenue of elms. Residents of Hugh Gaskell in the early 1800s. And in 1854, the house was so seriously damaged by fire as to necessitate a practical rebuilding. Richard Johnson, who was a bit of a character, who was the Mayor of Wigan, residing here in 1903 and held a party for the Wigan Grammar School boys. He was an ex-pupil at the grammar school. Richard was the son of a coal miner and leading light in getting Pemberton to join up with Wigan in 1904. If you didn't know, Pemberton used to be completely different to Wigan, wasn't a part of Wigan whatsoever at one point in history. And they reckon this Johnson, I think he was done for bribery, or they tried to do him for bribery. He was buying his mates pints in the pubs and stuff like that. We would take it for granted who's getting the next round in and all that. But because of his standing and stuff like that, they saw it as bribery. And unfortunately, for whatever property was left behind after he died, he thought it was in good hands with his wife. Unfortunately, the wife wasn't dealing with solicitors or anything. She was doing it herself. So there was a load of problems, went to the High Court for the family to get the property back into the Johnsons. Moving on. It's quicker when I was narrating from home. I don't know why it's so slow now. So the second one is, we'll call it Anderton Hall, the old off Old Hall Street. If anybody knows Ince, if you just come down Ince Green Lane, there's a little roundabout taking you to Clare House Surgery. So this is the 1849. As you can see, just sat there. There's no Bell Green Lane. There's no nothing, just farm tracks and stuff. 1890. It's changed a little bit. Mentions that there's a sundial. Old Hall Street is just coming up now. Still there, these properties, by the way. It's just been extended after the hall disappears in the 1920s. That's the 1920s, probably 1929 to 1930, because it's still here on the 29. You can see Church Street, Old Hall Street. Extension of Old Hall Street onto Foster Avenue, and the hall is basically number 1, 1A, and number 3, Violet Street. That's where it would have been. Oh, that's come out very nice. Just the street sign of Old Hall Street. That's how it looked at one time. So again, another grand property, that Tudor-esque type influence. So they might even have been Tudor themselves. So this is by Captain Latham again in 1818. Now, I'm very cautious of his descriptions at the bottom because some of them are wrong, as it's turned out. And this is, I believe this is where the confusion starts with the halls of Ince. And I called it Anderton Hall. It's not a bit of a light. Situated luckily at the end of Old Hall Street. And it was actually built in 1821 for the Ince family. So the area of Ince did have an Ince family. Anderton married Frances Sobieski Ince, daughter of Christopher, in 1769, in which turn, as the male usually did, inherited the estate in Ince. The Andertons had previously married into the Gerards, which is quite common in the 1500s, and already held some existing land in Ince. The Andertons were responsible for the building of the first Catholic chapel in Ince in 1760. It was built just before the law allowing the construction of Catholic chapels was passed. If you don't know anything about the law that was passed, it was quite archaic and tough. It had to look like this, had to look like that. So they were really under the cuff, but the Andertons got away with it and ended up building one. Believe it or not, the Andertons came from Exton Hall at Exton near Chorley, but they preferred to live at this house, at least until the time when the wife ended up passing away. And when they knocked the hall down, which I'm going to come down to, they've got William Anderton, Francis Anderton, 1785. That was on some date stone that was dug up. Today it's a private hospital if you've ever been to Exton. It looks very different today than it did back then. So that was the family home of the Andertons. He decided to stay in Ince until about 1820 when the wife died in 1816. So that's when he returned to Exton. I've got information that the hall was actually rebuilt post 1849 with materials used from the former. I don't have a great amount of information. It's one of those halls where I've really struggled to get some information on it. And in 1858, Anderton still owned the hall, albeit he's not lived there for 38 years, but he's kept all of the hall and the land that's associated. Now, it was actually demolished in the 1920s to extend Old Hall Street, which created Violet Street and Foster Avenue. Had its own chapel in which a tunnel was found in the back garden of a local resident in Violet Street in the 1930s. I think the story is he lifted a flagstone up and just some big tunnel about 3 feet in height. So the council came out and they determined it would have been a part of the chapel of the old hall. It's quite interesting that the last person to reside here was a fellow called Bennett. Do you see that guy there? That's Bennett. And these are the workers at the top. If you take note, they're taking the timbers out first. I don't know if there's any builders in the room, but I assume it would make the demolition a lot easier, not having the timbers in it, so you could just push the walls outwards. That's what I would have thought. And during the time of the demolition, Christopher Ince and his wife, ICM, 1708. So that's another bit of relevance to the Ince family. This is a funny one, to be quite frank with you, as you're going to see on the maps. So Morte Street, if you've been up there, has got scrapyard, different types of companies and stuff. But at the top, there's this 1810 little moat house building which survives. Why is it called the moat house? Well, you'll see in the next map, was a moat just where the Red Star was. And I believe the original hall, post, as I'll show you, post 1849, have been demolished. So you've got a moat that isn't moating anything. But yet the new hall, which I believe the original was in the middle, and I think they built the new one next to the moat house just here. Probably the similar age, to be quite honest with you. But again, it's the Gerrards. And there you go again. So moat on the 1894 map, moat house, and the new hall as well. 1929, a bit of a close-up view. This is the moat house. Still describes the moat, although it's slowly being silted up, and nature is trying to take it back for itself once again. And this is 1965, so there's no moat anymore, no nothing. Bit of a drain, a bit of a swampy area, but there's the moat house and the new hall, as they called it. Now, the new hall, I'm not aware of anyone really specifically important living in there. But again, it was owned by the Gerrards at some point at the beginning of the 17th century. The Gidlow sisters owned New Hall Colliery, which was quite close to it, and had a cotton mill at the bottom of the street. They actually lived at nearby Derbyshire House. On the 1881 census and 1891, there are colliers, certified colliery managers. 1911, New Hall appears to be separated into 4 cottages inhabited by coal miners. I believe it was a 3-story building. And just some evidence from the 1911, Bradshaw, he's a coal miner. Atherton, he's a coal miner as well. No doubt at New Hall Colliery. And this is the moat house. So 1810, and as the lady Margaret, who lives there, described, if she could pick it up and put it somewhere else, she'd be really happy with that, because it's just been absolutely surrounded by scrap yards and car breakers and what have you. So this is a little gem that's tucked away at the top of Moat House Street. And let's just look at the side of it. Now, the main one we're going on to, I've left the Hall of Ince in fourth because my second part of this presentation on the Walmesleys, their story begins at the Hall of Ince. Now, just to give you some context, this is Lawrence Cemetery. This building here was St. Mary's Church. Before that, it was the schools for the children. And of course, when they knocked down St. Mary's Church, they moved into the smaller building. That's recently been sold as well. So that'll be done up and whatever else. So the Hall of Ince was just tucked away in this woodland. And it was massively, massively encroached upon by the industries of Ince that came along during the Industrial Revolution. So it's interesting that 1849, so we go down Warrington Road as we now know it as. And the schools are about this, in this part of it, the hall, ornamental gardens, and there's this big lake at the back, which will become quite important when I show you some artist impressions in a minute. However, the lake disappears pretty soon after. So when I said about encroachment and stuff, industries, this is the Pemberton Loop line that runs straight through the lake, and the Hall of Ince needed this retaining wall to stop the sidings basically falling in onto the hall. So this is a plan of, they were doing lots of different drainage works and stuff, and this reservoir that was put in, assumingly feeding the steam, or it might have provided local water. I'm not massively sure. So in 1894, you can see the halls there, the schools are now there, and the railway abutting the top of the hall, and that's that little reservoir as well that we just mentioned. 1908, the railway running straight through. We've got Burgess Street now. I'll show you a picture of what that looks like today. And of course, the schools, or latterly, the Church of St. Mary's. This is 1956. Pretty much the same setup with the schools, Burgess Street. The Hall of Ince and remains of Hall, so I don't think it was doing much in the 1950s. This is an incomplete sketch in 1818 by Captain Latham. I don't know why he never finished it. So this is one angle of the Hall of Ince. And what I'd like you to do is just take note of this tree, because I don't believe it's native to this country, and these two gables, because a fellow called Phillips in the 1820s puts the same tree on it, and there's those two gables, and that lake I was telling you about, that was filled in. You can just make it out there. Thomas Whitehouse, 1842. Did I tell you that the guy lacked a bit of artistic license? Because the pond's been massively extended up the side of the hall, which it never was. So on the previous, you had that tree that was about here. So this, you'd think it was a completely different property. But fortunately, the gables all line up. Everything's in the right place, albeit out of context by Whitehouse. I don't know who did this. I need to really speak with the ladies at the museum and figure it out. But this is on Wigan World. I think everything's on Wigan World. You know, it's so many pictures you can get from there. But again, do you remember those two gables I told you to look out for? And these two possibly non-native trees as well. And this is that lake. It's quite picturesque, I expect, at some point in time before the industry started coming along. Now, in 1900, the Walmesleys were told that they needed to do a little bit of work here. They'd been letting the property out, renting it out to numerous local people, the vicar at St Mary's, Pearson and Knowles Coal and Iron Company were using it as their offices and stuff. So basically, the idea was, it seems to be very quite, I know it's late Victorian, but very Victorian to just get rid of any ancient timbers and stuff like that and just render it. So it's fully rendered, as you can see, some steps going down into what was the moat. It was another moated site at some point. And just for another 3 or 4 slides time, I just want you to just take note of that ridge tile just at the very end there, because I think that was put on at the same time, but 1900. And these are great, what Jim sent me. Nice fancy car there. See the railway just behind it? So this was the entrance, nice doorway and stuff, but it had already been partitioned again. So 3 or 4 different dwellings. It's quite common in all these old halls in Wigan. They were losing money and whatever else. So they thought, well, if we just split them into 3 or 4 and just take some rent, we'll be all right. I like this one because you see the children. It's like with the nan or something like that. And the gate. And again, that railway running right at the back end of the house. So as you might have guessed, the Walmesleys definitely weren't living here, having a railway at the back. They were doing in Bath at this time. Hall of Ince again by Jim, that motor car, the gate, and the railway again. Remember that concrete ridge tile I told you about 3 slides ago? Well, me and Ron went for a wander last year on the site of what was the Hall of Ince. I thought, oh, that looks quite familiar. I'm sure it's one of the ridge tiles off the hall, so silly old me, step-toe son sort of guy. I brought it home with me. It's ornamenting the backyard at the moment. So one of this guy became quite well known in religious circles in Ince as time went on. And again, the hall owned by the Gerards since 1368, from the marriage into the Inces. So it's that name again, Gerard. In 1694, there was a government inquiry into the Hall of Ince as to whether it was being used for illegal religious purposes. There was a lot of stuff going on back then, the Reformation before that. So, you know, people were snitching on people and saying this might be happening, they might be doing this, that doesn't quite fall in line with what we want to do. And in the meantime, this is where the Walmesleys start getting interesting, because this John Walmesley purchases the Hall of Ince in 1716 from Richard Gerard of Aspel Manor and Bryn. There were 2 parts of the Gerards. It's way too complicated for me to explain to you tonight, I'm afraid. But there are books and stuff like that out there that will tell you a lot more about it. So Walmesley was living at Higher Barn Farm in Hinley, and as we'll see, that's still there. That was built in 1650. And the fella came from Blackburn originally, so he clearly had some money. I just haven't quite worked out sort of from where, if you like. It's probably just owning land. And in 1858, the Walmesleys still owned the Hall of Ince, along with 440 acres. At this time, they were living in Bath. And mission work actually began at the hall in 1862, at the old barn, in the hall in 1862, led by Thomas Francis Fergus, later canon, and vicar of Ince for 30 years. So the people who are that way inclined in Ince will be fully aware of Canon Fergie and a lot of the good things that he was doing. Oh, look, this is fantastic. So again, it was rendered in 1900, as I've said, and split into 3 dwellings. Ancient timber at the rear replaced. However, in 1919, they needed to build the retaining wall. I think there was some concern about the railway siding because it was a viaduct, essentially, about it collapsing onto the house. So they build this retaining wall, but however, they find this, a timber frame with a mortar and pestle were discovered at the rear of the property whilst digging the footings for a retaining wall abutting the railway. I reckon that ancient timber is the stuff they have probably pulled off for the rendering and just decided to bury it. Residents of numerous tenants, including Pearson and Knowles, which used them as their offices from 1867, and the Reverend Bryson of St Mary's Church. The Hall of Ince was demolished in the 1970s and the railway bridge around the same time. Now, I only came across this photo by David Long, used to be the vicar at St Mary's, some time ago. Now, do you remember the Pemberton Loop line that went straight along to the hall? So if you imagine that's the loop line with the bridge, this is Warrington Road. Burgess Street's just off-site, but there's where the houses would have been. So it's gone this way. And so it's basically just about around here. So as you can see, that tree line on the right-hand side would have been the viaduct or the line, as it were. And those properties just on the left would have been here. I mean, do you not find it really frustrating that they can knock decent properties down like that and build absolutely nothing in its place? I found Wigan and Ince are just surrounded by these random patches of land, and you think, why don't you just build on the same footprint if they became slums or whatever else? All right, moving on. I did say the first part was sort of like the first third, if you like, of the overall presentation. And the Walmesleys of the Hall of Ince is going to take 2/3 of the presentation. You do, yeah, you'll miss the 10 o'clock news and all that thing as well. Please take into account that I've tried to do this strictly in chronological order. And some of the Walmesleys in the 1600s and the 1700s, I am afraid, I can't get much information on these guys. It's almost like they went below the radar. However, they were a part of the aristocracy and whatever else. So it gets dead interesting in the Victorian times when we start talking about the last of the paternal line of the Walmesleys and the Russians and the links to the Tsar and stuff like that. So it generally does get blooming interesting. So you'll just have to bear with me in the first sort of dozen slides or whatever for basically lack of information, but I'll give it a go anyway. So just to set the scene nicely, I thought, well, instead of just saying that the Walmesleys are in Wigan or in Ince, what was going on in Wigan around that time? So in 1603, it was the building of the Standish Grammar School. 1619, Peter Platt drives his coal mining operations on Millgate. Do you remember when they was building the Wigan International Pool in the 60s and they found all these tunnels? Well, that's one of the pictures from the findings, and they was started to block things up and started to fill everything in. 1644, the battle or the siege at Latham House. 1651, the Battle of Wigan Lane and the Tilsley Memorial, which my colleague Sean mentioned on the recent walk, which was good. 1670, Ogilvy visits Wigan and mentions how it's well known for its pewter and ironmongery. Anyone know what Ogilvy became famous for? The road atlas. He went round England plotting out all of the roads and stuff like that. So you'll find some of the road atlases. I know they don't sit on the back seat of your car anymore. Everybody's got sat navs. But you'll find Ogilvy, like Ogilvy's, A to Z or whatever else. So he was the guy. He was the forerunner for the street atlas in the UK. And in 1675, there was a vessel of 200 silver coins, possibly Roman coins, that was found somewhere in the north of the town. So beginning with the Walmesleys, so they all seemingly came from around Preston, Blackburn area. And the Walmesleys that we're dealing with, again, came from Blackburn, settled for a short time in Hindley, as I did mention in part 1 about Higher Barn Farm. Wigan itself in the Holgate area. then Preston, Bath, a little village called Cologne in Wiltshire, and then finally settling over in France. So the guy from Blackburn is in the first one. The earliest record I have is this guy, this John Walmesley. By the way, they're all called John. So if apart from one of them, well, that's only by chance. So you'll go to bed tonight, John, all in your head all the time. So yeah, they're called John. So I'm not repeating the same person with different dates. They're genuinely called John. And this fella came from Blackburn, and according to Burke's Landed Gentry, John Walmesley, Esquire of Blackburn, and it just says who his descendants were, which we're also going to cover. But according to Burke's, that's all they've got. John Walmesley of Blackburn, and that's it. And that's why I'm struggling to get any further back on the family tree. So this is John, married into the Hortons of Horton Tower, which I'm going to show you in a minute. It's an unbelievable place, and the Hortons still live there. They've been there for about 1,000 years. So that's his first marriage, and then his second to Murray Hurl. I think her father was a solicitor in Wigan. We'll come to that. So I mentioned Higher Barn Farm, listed building, built in 1650. I said probably living at Higher Barn after arriving from Blackburn because I haven't got any other evidence to suggest that he was living anywhere else. He had two brothers, one named Lawrence, who produced two daughters, and the other was John. He was admitted to Gray's Inn in 1680 and listed as the third son of John of Blackburn. In 1709, John Walmesley of Her Barn, as it says on the old documents, it's me that's translated and figured out it's Higher Barn, was leased in land in Hinley from Edward Langton, Esquire. So again, it gives you an idea of the time and place that this Walmesley was knocking around in Hinley, in and around Wigan. And as I mentioned in the previous, he purchased the Hall of Ince from Richard Gerard in 1716. Now, the Gerards supported the Royalist cause during the Civil War and had some lands confiscated. Of course, in most events, they were later returned. But he was flogging bits of land off in Ince, basically, trying to make some money. So this John Walmesley, whilst living in Hinley, has made the purchase of the Hall of Ince, which, as you'll soon find out, I think he purchased it as a title rather than somewhere I'm going to live. So they started to be called John Walmesley of the Hall of Ince, etc., etc. Now, he was already in the employ of Sir Richard Horton, 3rd Baronet of Horton Tower, which turns out quite nice for him, really, because this is Horton Tower. Now, you can go and visit there at some point, and I would suggest to Claire that the Society should probably make some arrangements and go here. It looks like an unbelievable place, and the Hortons have been there for about 1,000 years. So this John Walmesley was 47 when he got married to Sir Richard's daughter, who was already a divorcee. He was a widow, and also stone blind. Not a nice term we would use nowadays for somebody who's suffering with blindness, but she was she was clearly taken in by the clerk of her father, being John Walmesley. She thought, I want to marry that man, so she did. But her first marriage was to a fellow called Humphrey Dimmock, who left her with a great wealth upon his death. Now, the Hortons apparently were descended from Hervey de Walter, one of the companions of William the Conqueror, and through the female line from Lady Godiva of Coventry. Do you know when I said folklore in the first part? This is another one. If you've heard the story of Godiva, I'm sorry, I'm not buying it. I just think it's a fantastic thing to attach to your family, a bit like the Bradshaws at Hay and whatever else. But I'm not so sure about it. So when Sarah passed away in 1699 without issue with John, John remarried in Wigan to Mary Hurley with the daughter of Edward, Esquire of Wigan. Now, Edward died in 1709, but his sons-in-law at the time were John Walmesley and Robert Holt, as in Holt-Lee fame, as we'll be coming on to quite soon. So he made those executors of the will. Holt married Edward's daughter, Loveday Hurl. It's a nice name, Loveday. And a bit more on Holt-Lee, and I said he had a bit of a shady life, if you like. So the audience may recognise a descendant of Mr. Holt, Sir Robert Holt-Lee, Member of Parliament of Whitley, Wigan, and Hinley Hall, 1st Baronet. That's the only picture I've ever seen. See the building in the background? That's Whitley Hall. It's the only picture that I've actually seen of it. And this is Hindley as well, now known as Hindley the Golf. I think it's a golf course now in the clubhouse. John Walmesley ended up outliving both of his wives and passed away in 1726 in Hallgate. Now, I ask straight away, why not at the Hall of Ince? Now, these guys owned numerous amounts of property, but in the next generation, we'll see the same again, where there's family members dying in Hallgate. And he was buried at Wigan All Saints as well. So I mentioned about Holt Lee. Well, he had a notorious affair with the wife of one of his tenant farmers. Lee adopted the son of Sarah and Thomas Yates and gave him the name Lee. I always think, the father, why would you ever accept that as the thing to do with your own child? I don't know, unless there's quite a lot of money that's crossed over. I don't know. Well, that's what he did. So he was unmarried, was Holt Lee, but he decided to get it on one of his tenant farmers anyway. So when all things will come to an end, all things do come to an end, and this first John Walmesley dies in 1726. However, it takes about 8 years for the will to be executed and for trustees to be put in place and stuff. So it's said that he is of great age, and John Walmesley becomes the executor, which is his son as well. But what I'm more interested in is the nice things that they can do at the time. So it's stuff like £5 to be given to the poor housekeepers in Wigan. £5 back then, I can assure you, would have been an all right bit of money for the cause. And this part as well, £100 to his son, John Walmesley, and Thomas Sargent of Ince, Senior and Junior, in trust to provide linen for the poor of Ince. Now, I found this in there's a Charity Commission report in 1830. It actually says that this was going on for quite a number of years. So they generally distributed at Candlemas every alternate year to about 64 persons of the township not receiving regular relief. So that's John from 1645 to 1726. So we're going to go into the 1700s, but what was going on in town in the 1700s? So outside of the Moot Hall, which would have been somewhere around there, 5 Jacobites on the way to Preston were executed in Wigan. To replace the Moot Hall, the new Town Hall of 1720, just 4 years later, became known as a shambles. Well, if you look at some of the subsidence and all the awkward windows and whatever else, you can see why it was called a shambles. But I think it was more that there was butchers, all sorts of stuff on the ground floor, but yet the hustings would take place on the balcony and the town hall itself was upstairs. And I've made a note from, if you've not seen the barbarous murder of Wigan Lane on YouTube that Jim did for the Society, and he mentions Anderton as being one of the suspects to the murder of a fellow called Colton. Now, Anderton somehow got out of his chains and stuff, came down the balcony, down one of the posts, and wandered off. But they did catch up with him in later time. But there's something dodgy going on there. I think he might have known one of the officers or whatever else. And I mentioned those other Walmsleys and trying not to get confused with them, because this is Walmesley House on Bishopgate, if you like. You just see J.R. Winstanley House, that little spire there. So the Young Pretender, the Bonnie Prince, supposedly stayed there. But again, how many other people in different towns would have proclaimed that the Bonnie Prince stayed with them? It was the cool thing, I suppose. So, but I'm fairly certain that he did. There is some evidence to suggest that was the case. And in 1770, there was already a small stretch of canal in Wigan, but the Leeds-Liverpool was officially began in 1770. I think it's something like 1814 that it was finished. And I'm sure we'll all appreciate the navvies and everybody else who built that were just made of iron, unbelievable. And the working conditions and how they moved all the rubble was incredible. And in 1796 was the precursor to what we now know as the Wigan Hospital. This was the Wigan Dispensary on King Street, so to provide relief and support for general Wigan people who were in ill health. And by 1801, not just Wigan in the town itself, but it's also its outer districts. The population's about 11,000 people. So that sets the scene. That's some of the things that were going on in town at that time. But also, it makes me wonder, where was everybody? Because in a lot of ways, Hallgate, Millgate and stuff all around Wigan, there were silversmiths, goldsmiths, jewellers, linen dealers, rope makers. I could go on all night, but they were all businessmen and clearly educated. And I just think I think this is the sort of thing that we had in town at the time. Lots of rich people, or the Wigan notables, sat in the Dog and Partridge Club, which we call the Bee's Knees. But then it's now been returned back to the Dog and Partridge. It's actually quite an old building. So it does sort of fit in with the time. Now, if you want to go and see this, it's currently on display down at the museum at the bottom of Library Street. I think it's fantastic. And I genuinely believe before the Industrial Revolution came and the poverty came off the back of it, this is what Wigan was pretty much like before that. Oh, look, another John. 1704 to 1750. So this is a man that didn't live very long. So he marries into the Bradel family. Again, nationally significant local bigwigs, linked to the crown and whatever else. Then I believe he was born in Hindley. However, he was baptised at St Wilfrid's at Standish. I asked myself why not Wigan. So I'm not too sure about that. So it's quite a distance between Hindley coming into Wigan to go up to Standish. So he married Anne Bradel in Ulverston. She was actually brought up at this place called Conishead Priory. I mean, it's never a semi-detached house, is it, somewhere? You know, it's always these sorts of places. Anne was a descendant of Everard Bradel, cupbearer to Edward III, you know, so it's just rubbing shoulders with all these people again. Now, 5 generations of the Bradels lived at Conishead between 1683 and 1847. And since 1976, quite interestingly, it's become the home of Buddhist communities. Around this time again, not 1976, the time in question, John Walmesley is responsible for leasing out some land in Hindley to others, according to a document within the family papers at Preston, dated 1738. John, I mentioned dying at Hallgate and not the Hall of Ince. So his son's also died in Hallgate. And I can just imagine it's some big townhouse of some description. And I've just mentioned there as his father did. And his wife, Anne, passed away in Hallgate in 1774. So she sort of outlived him by 24 years, but yet they're living in the same place. And up to now, I haven't found any clear evidence of the Walmesleys since the 1716 purchase of the Hall of Ince that they ever lived there. As you saw to the previous, before I showed you the Hall of Ince, the other two were grand properties, you know, and you think, well, why live at Hall of Ince when you've got all them there? So I don't know. And as a bit of a side note, one of the daughters, Sarah, married a fella called Parr, who came from Dublin and born in 1725. He actually became the governor of Nova Scotia in the colonial times from 1782 up until his death in 1791. Now, not to make a joke of how he looks, but if I was having somebody doing a sketch and I was paying, you can see where I'm going with this, and I was paying good money for this, I'd make sure he did something about my nose. So, and I'm going to regret saying that because I've been working with a descendant of this Colonel Parr called Nick, and he's done a lot of work on the Walmesleys as well. So I hope he doesn't take any great offence to what I've just said. And this is a funeral hatchment. Now, you find hatchments usually high on the wall in a church somewhere, but they were actually carried at the front of the funeral procession. And Jim was telling me how they could be up to 6 feet in size, some of these things. So they were quite heavy, clunky things, but they always had the coat of arms in there as well. So again, it's prestige, isn't it? John Walmesley, 1740 to 1829. So there he is. So he married a lady from Preston. So not too far from us, is it? So he was baptised at Wigan All Saints. Why wouldn't you be if he was already living on Hallgate? So he was quite successful because he became the Sheriff of Lancashire in 1765, later captain of the 16th Light Dragoons, Justice of the Peace, Deputy Lieutenant. Now, what were the Dragoons doing? They were basically a scouting network for the army at the time. So these people on horseback are just doing reconnaissance and whatever else. What's quite interesting and what sets him apart from the leading Catholic family over at Westwood House, he adopted Protestantism not in keeping with the Catholic Walmesleys over at Westwood House. So that sort of doesn't put a dividing line in place, but it says that they might be just a little bit different. So he married Mary Shaw of Preston, and it was always usually at the same town that the lady came from. Her father, William Shaw, came from Singleton and married Anne Cunliffe. And her father was quite a bigwig as well. So it's one of my favourite pictures of the parish church before it was all changed around in the 1800s, because, it sets the scene, and just to the right-hand side, there's the Dog and Partridge with all those bigwigs sat in it, it's perspective and context, And again, I said he was married at this church in Preston, and this is what it looked like, St. John. Quite nice. He lived in Preston for some time, probably at the home of his wife, before moving the family down to Bath. Now, this was a big change. This was, we've got money. We're going to go and settle down in Bath, where the air is so-called better. We breathe better air, we'll live longer lives. Mentioning Holt-Lee previously, well, John was the parliamentary agent for Sir Robert Holt-Lee. It was actually his cousin, and he actually died at the circus in Bath in 1829, aged 89. Anybody ever heard of the circus in Bath? Fantastic. Look at that. That's just an architect's dream, really. Absolutely beautiful. And for a little bit of a coincidence, the Royal Crescent was about not even half a mile away. The Westwood Walmesleys had property there. So again, two branches of Walmesleys and Wigan, but they're in Bath, and they're living literally a quarter of a mile from each other. And this is quite nice. So St. Swithin's in Bath, sacred to the memory of John Walmsley, Esquire of Ince, near Wigan. Notice the mention of Ince. Many years a resident of this city, died 29th of October 1829, aged 89. The remains are deposited in the vault beneath. This is his wife, who unfortunately died just a couple of years previous to that. So again, wife of John Walmsley, Esquire of the circus, an eldest daughter of William Cunliffe Shaw, Esquire of Singleton or Preston, Lancashire. John Walmsley, 1775 to 1860. There is a Richard in a minute, so it's all right. So this guy married twice. Again, not that he didn't like his first wife. They just generally died young sometimes. So he married this Irish lady called Hannah Comran. And her family came from County Cork, the southernmost county or territory in Ireland. But this John was actually born 28th of December 1775 in Preston. So that's what tells me that the father probably settled there for some time before moving down to Bath. He was also baptised in the same place. So he married this Hannah Comran in 1797, who came from County Cork. Her father already an esquire, or seemed to be an esquire, Christopher Comran. Hannah passed away in 1808 and left issue John, who died in 1832 unmarried. William died a bachelor in 1878. Mary Ann died 1817 without issue. And Christopher in 1874, who married and had no issue. And this is the memorial at St. Swithin's, first of all to Hannah, and then one of the daughters who unfortunately died of, as it's described, of the measles. So it's come to be very nice, and back then there's not much you can do about it, is there? So the fella remarried at Steeple Ashton in Wiltshire, beautiful little village, to Ellen Long, and the Longs were again one of those big names in England back in the day. So in 1841 they're living at the circus in Bath. Now this is where it gets quite interesting, because 10 years later he's living at a farm in Dewlish in Dorset with his wife, 3 daughters and son Richard. Now this farm belonged, I believe, to Dewlish House, which is a Grade 1 property in this day and age, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And there's evidence that his death in 1860, so from 1851 to 1860, in that space of 9 years, he's moved into Dewlish. I'll show you what it looked like in 1 second. Earlier that year, John had donated money to the Wigan and District Volunteer Rifles. So you can just see this annual descriptions, the usual faces like Francis Sharp Powell, and then smaller donations from John Walmsley, Esquire of Dorset, and his son Richard, Esquire of Dorset. A miniature portrait of John was stolen from a family descendant in a house burglary in 1974. And that's such a shame, because if you notice something, I haven't shown you a single picture of any Walmesley because I don't have one. And it's such a shame. So I asked one of the relatives who now lives in Australia, and she said, I'm sorry, the house was burgled in 74. They took all my jewellery. And more important to her was this miniature portrait of John Walmesley that disappeared with it. Well, sorry, and this being the property that Ellen was brought up in and home of the Longs. The father was a fellow called Godolphin Long, and I think he was an MP, another big wig. That's Julish House. So he was living there at the time of his death in 1860. Now, you think of the money that's coming in at that time to justify renting a place like that down south. And I'm just on about Wigan and Ince, the money that was coming in from there. So it was owned by, I don't know if it's Mikel or Michelle, we'll say Mikel, owned by the Mikel family from 1756. Field Marshal John Mikel retired here in 1880 until his death in 1886. So in between that, at some point, John Walmesley's lived and died there. And it was grade 1. You can see it's clearly worth a grade 1 listing, isn't it? In 1956. So, we probably need permission to cut the edges out and everything, So going on and moving on, Ince in the 1800s wasn't half becoming not the place that we saw in the first part of the presentation, where it had all those nice houses in it, and it was all surrounded by beautiful fields, trees, woodland, farms. It's really, really becoming industrialised at that point in time. So he's selling some land, at least to the Ince Burial Board in the previous decade, for the laying of a cemetery, which went on to include 2 chapels designed by architect Alfred Waterhouse. Funnily enough, as mentioned by Jim previous to the talk, we're trying to restore those 2 sorry-looking chapels at Ince. You probably know the ones I'm talking about. And these were some of the first works of this national, highly regarded architect. And for further information on YouTube is Sean Jinks's presentation on Alfred Waterhouse. He'll tell you all about him. So this John died in 1860, as we said previous. However, his headstone, which is a bit of a mess and needs a bit of a wash, reads John Walmesley, Esquire, of the Hall of Ince. Again, it's that title. It's that thing. It's that, of the Hall of Ince, But I often wonder if someone said, that sounds nice. Where's that? And you think, it's in Ince, just in the outskirts of Wigan. But at that point in 1860, it's all been encroached. The lake's gone. The railway runs right behind it. The Wigan wagon works are only half a mile away. Everything's going on, so it's not as leafy as you would one would suspect. So he's died, but his wife and his widow find the place on the 1861 census just 1 year later. So Ellen is living with the daughter at 69 Gloucester Terrace, Kensington, which is his place. Again, they were never little flats or anything like that. They're always big, bonny places. Ellen died here in 1864 and is buried with her husband at Bath Abbey. So she'll be in the same place as this headstone is as well. Told you. Well, it's by luck, really. I've missed it, but it doesn't matter, right? So it's Richard Walmesley from the second marriage to Ellen Long. However, the first marriage to the Irish lady, Hannah Comran, was a John Walmesley, but he died in his 30s. So this is where history and families changed dramatically, because it would appear to me, if John still continued to be alive, he would have been Lord of the Manor. However, it went to Richard, who was, I think it was like the 3rd son from the second marriage. Why not the first son? Well, there's a clue, Reverend. She went into church affairs. William, property and whatever else. But I'd have thought that William would have been the guy to take over, but obviously not. It's been given to Richard. And Richard would be the one also that starts to exercise the family wealth somewhat. So he was born in 1816 in Bath and 3rd son of John and Ellen Walmesley. Richard kept wicket for the cricketers in here. Richard kept wicket and appeared in a single first-class match for Cambridge University in 1836. Not much of a claim to fame, but it's on Wikipedia, so I thought I'd use it. He graduated from St John's College, Cambridge in 1839 with a Bachelor of Arts, in Arts. Admitted to the Middle Temple in 1839 and 1842, It was always like an automated thing they had going, so he became a master's, an MA. He became a lawyer and was called to the bar in 1842, specialising in equity draftsmanship and conveyancing. Perfect for somebody who owns land and owns lots and lots of property. So he's probably dealing with half of his own stuff. I have no evidence that he ever worked, i.e. became a judge or anything like that. But then again, why would you? You've got so much money coming in and you've been privately educated as well. So a bit of a link to Wigan, after he's married to a lady called Anne Eliza Donaldson in 1849. She came from Dorset. They're both living in Westminster in 1861. The couple had one child in July 1861, another John, affectionately known as Johnny. If you've read my article on the website called The Victorian Playboy, it's all about him, but it's coming up anyway. And it was in 1867 that the Hall of Ince schools, as you can see in the photograph, all that's left is this little building that's recently been sold, and it was St Mary's School for a while. It was actually paid for by Pearson and Knowles and officially opened on land presented by Richard and is described as opposite the road from the offices of Pearson and Knowles, formerly known as Old Ince Hall. See what I mean about all these Ince Hall titles? I want to call it Old Ince Hall. It's the Hall of Ince, you know. So, but again, that's where the confusion starts to kick up, and even in 1867. So some of his legal background probably came into play somewhat when he was given the titles Justice of the Peace and High Sheriff of Wiltshire. So he's been a magistrate for some time in his life. And again, 1851, when I mentioned Shepherd Farm, or at least his father was living there. This is Richard, 2 years married with Anne Eliza Donaldson, and he's still living with the parents. Barrister, not in practice, and wife of a both. 1861, they moved around a lot, by the way. They don't seem to be very static. So in 1861, they're living on Clifford Street in Westminster. Again, Richard, wife, Anne, and just a couple of servants in tow as well. 1871, it's not the best. You can just make out Richard Walmesley and the wife, John, or Johnny, as we're going to call him. He preferred to be called Johnny. So that's what I'm going to call him later on in presentation. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 servants. Why not? 1881, for some strange reason, I can't find him, his wife, or Johnny, the son. However, they did a couple of interesting things in the year of 1881. So I'm going to go on to it, but Richard exercised the family wealth somewhat by buying an estate called Lucknam Park in Wiltshire. And what he did was he made sure that the local villagers didn't miss out around Christmas time and stuff. So he distributed 20 tons of coal amongst the poor folk, and the same gentleman added to his other generosity by giving away on Christmas Eve 675 pounds of beef and nearly 200 plum puddings. So no one in the whole parish liked a Christmas dinner. So I always say it, you've got money, you're living in a big house, you're a lot more fortunate than the average working class person. You have to be seen to be giving something back. So I'm not saying he did it just to cover his own back. He might have been an incredibly nice man, but this is generally something that they took part in public affairs, and that's where the respect came in a lot of ways as well. Now, I find this interesting on the right because this is a removal of debt to the Wigan Hospital, which has only been going for 11 years, but yet it's saddled in bits of debt. I don't know why. I assume it's something to do with beds and treatment and needing different bits of equipment. But as you can see, to relieve the debt, you've got all these the local bigwigs, Gerard, Crawford, Pearson of Pearson and Knowles, Wigan Coal and Iron Company, once again, Francis Sharp Powell, Timothy Cooper and Company on Downing Street, Miss Rachel Hardman. I'm not too sure who the Hardmans were, but here's Richard Walmesley of Chippenham, or Lucknam Park, sending up his donation of £50. Not as much as the others, but 50 quid, like I say, back then, it's a fair bit of money, really. In 1891, he's living at the Eversfield Hotel in St Leonard's. Is it St Leonard's on Sea? Something like that. Richard, Anne, and just a couple of servants at the same time. His son isn't with him because, well, we'll come on to that in a minute. So the purchase of Lucknam Park Estate actually came in the early 1870s. It's only 9 miles northeast of Bath, and it consisting of around 1,100 acres. They were rent out land mostly in Wigan, which usually formed collieries. Now, what's interesting is they didn't just take rent or ground rent from these coal mine owners, but the Walmesleys were doing it in return for a basic lease and a commission for every barrow load of coal brought to the surface. Now, you imagine back then how much coal is coming out of Wigan and Ince. And this guy, if it happened to be his land, is putting a tax on every single barrow load of coal. He's making a fortune. Unfortunately, all things come to an end. And unfortunately, the timing of his death in 1893 coincides with what we're going to go into in a moment. Some of the interesting behaviours of his only son, Johnny Walmesley. Richard would spend the wintertime in the south of France again, got the money. They'll have a villa down there in previous years, and he was actually buried in his private vault at Cologne. There's no pictures online. If you go on the Historic England website, they won't let you copy anything. So this is my best attempt at trying to copy a picture of the vault that's got these conifer, horrible looking trees, really. And that's the vault where he's been buried in. It was actually gifted to the church, the local church, which was next to Lucknam some years later. This is Lucknam Park. So it's like looking at Hale, but in a different part of the country. So you've got the manor house in the middle. This is the big turning circle, the big drive. And the sort of grey area that I'm just going around with the laser was the extent of the 1,100 acres. And then you've got other landowners and stuff who are on the outside. What did it look like on the inside? Well, they're not great, these pictures, but they're the only ones I've got. So these portraits are of the Long family, who I mentioned a generation ago. So this is 1900, showing Richard's heart and family portraits as well. So you can see there's some statues and whatever else. It's not the most clear, but I'm appreciative of the gentleman Simon Garrett for sending me that photograph. And then there's another of the drawing room. The door's open just there. You know, I mean, this isn't just a lifestyle, is it? It's a lavish lifestyle. And it's all coming off the back of their estates, mostly in Lancashire, particularly Wigan, Ince, Hindley, and Westley. So he'd written his will 3 years previous in 1890, and his estate was valued at over £66,000. 2017, about 5.4 million quid. So it's not bad. So £11,000 bequeathed to his surviving wife, Anne, 1,000 to his only son, Johnny Walmesley, and 1,000 each to sisters Ellen Mary Walmesley and Anne Catherine Emma Walmesley, who married a fellow called Solto. Unfortunately, I haven't had the time, and I was worried that I'd just keep going and going. And again, you would be here till midnight. So I didn't want to do that. The freehold, copyhold, and leasehold estates in Lancashire to his wife for life and then to his son. So when the wife would pass away, as it usually would happen, the eldest son then picked up the estate. It goes on to say that after his son's marriage 4 years previously, he already handed in certain real estate in the county of Wiltshire. Now, this is drawn by a fellow called Hugh Armstead. It's a effigy of Richard. Now, the statue of him lied down, just like you see in bed. He's actually in the church of St. John the Baptist at Cologne. So you can actually go and see it for yourself. And that's the church. And that's the church itself. And that's just a bit of an obituary from the local press to mention that Richard Walmesley of Lucknam Park has passed away. So, one of the interesting pieces of art you'll probably recognise for the art type people in the room. He had a painting by Dolce, or Dolce's version of the Adoration of the Magi, which he specifically left to his son. I've tried to trace this. So there's one at Kellingrove Art Gallery, who acquired one from Archibald McClellan collection in 1854. That's up in Glasgow. There is a smaller, more delicate one at Blenheim Palace, belonging to the Duke of Marlborough, and also one at Bursley House, Peterborough, once owned by the 5th Earl of Exeter. Now, I've spoke to a family relative about this and thought, oh, where's it gone? Where is it? You know, that he reckons it sits with the National Gallery. Now, I've emailed the National Gallery, and they reckon this version, they picked it up in 1990, but they're being very old-fashioned with me about it. They won't tell me what the provenance is, so I don't know who they bought it from, or any historic provenance to say that it once belonged to the Walmesleys. So maybe in a couple of years' time, they might just tell me, basically, how they came about it. And just a memorial just outside of Lucknam Park, you can see in the middle of the village at Culhern. Always erected by public subscription, as they used to say. Grateful appreciation of the many benevolent acts of Richard Walmesley, Esquire of Lucknam, 1893. That's the base, and that's the top of it as well, just this column. Brace yourself. I kid you not, if it's not confusing already, it might just start getting confusing. Johnny had 4 women in his life, so he wasn't traditional by any means. So when I say about trying to keep things strictly in chronological order, please bear with me, and I hope I've done it correctly. It's the only way I could do it. So, the only son of Richard and Anne, as we already mentioned, he was born in Chelsea in London. Parents living in Clifford Street, Westminster at the time of the census of that year. Like his father Richard, he attended Winchester College and had a coming-of-age party at the Wigan Public Hall in August 1882. Now, that's the Wigan Public Hall. I think it was by far the finest building on King Street before they knocked it down. It became the Wigan Examiner later on. But for me, it's the workmanship in the arch window and the keystone at the top. It's a work of art, not just for the architect, but for the builder as well. A lot of pride. So that's where his coming of age, his 21st, was held. And I think they presented him with a silver service. Again, I wonder what happened to the silver. Now he was a bit of a renegade. He's seeing this girl. He's not told the parents about this girl, but he's met this young girl called Lydia Rose Powell in Paddington in London. And they've ended up having a child on Christmas Eve, 1887. Lydia Eve Walmesley Powell. Although she's not officially a Walmesley, they kept the name. And this was the property they were living at. It's on York Terrace. His father, Richard, actually threatened to leave Johnny from the will if he didn't find somebody of a suitable position in society. Not very nice, but he's already got his card in, Johnny, because he's had a child with this lady, out of wedlock and all that, you know. So on the 4th of December, 1889, Johnny married a lady from a landed family called Violet Hayworth Booth at St. John's, Newlands in Hull. Her family hailed from Hayworth Hall, or Hull Bank, as they called it. On the 21st of November 1890, Violet gave birth to their only son, Richard, at Norfolk Square, London. That would be the dashing young man there. Notice as time's gone on, we start getting photographs and stuff as photography starts becoming more popular. On the left is the church which they married at in Hull, and this is the family home of the Hayworths, or the Hayworth Booths, and that's still there today. However, he was married only for 2 years, and on the 1891 census, you'd have fully expected him living happily ever after with his wife and his son Richard. However, he's living with this girlfriend, this first lady, this Lydia Rose, and I put Mrs. Walmesley in brackets because he wanted the locals to call her or acknowledge her as Mrs. Walmesley like they were married, and they never were. And the daughter Lydia Eve at 27 York Terrace, Regent's Park in London. At that time, again, they've only been married 2 years. You'd expect them to be living together, but Violet was residing at the family home in Hull with Richard, who at that time was only 4 months of age. Now, there's a reason for this coming up. It's not very nice subject. So in 1892, Violet actually learned of her husband's relations with Lydia Rose and filed for divorce with a host of accusations. In June 1893, Violet won her case based upon adultery and cruelty and won full custody of the son. His father had passed away the previous month. Do you know what I said about the timing of his father's death coincided with some of the behaviour of his son? So I'm not going to tell you the contents because the Times printed it back in the day, and you can get all the drains are up on Walms and what he was getting up to, but he wouldn't spend any time with her on the honeymoon. Wouldn't share the same table when they was eating. When she tried to make conversation, he would walk out of the room. The man didn't want to be with this lady. It was almost enforced because of his father's will. He wanted to be with this Lydia. And of course, on the 1891 census, he is back with Lydia. Now, how about this? 1891 census, John Walmesley, blank and blank. Why is it blank? He's covering his own tracks. So he's describing Lydia at the time as his wife, which she wasn't, and the daughter, Lydia Eve, is living with him. The times are right, the dates are right, the ages are right. So the guy filling in the census return, I do wonder how John encouraged him not to mention the other two names, but we'll never know. Unfortunately, Lydia Rose would then pass away in 1896. She was only 29 due to severe asthma. So that left Johnny not only without his first love interest, but a divorcee of Violet as well, and the daughter that resulted from Lydia Rose Powell. And Violet has already got the son up at full as well. So some of his decisions are coming back to bite him a little bit. So these are some of the decisions that Johnny was making at that time. And just to show down here, just the probate entry, 27 York Terrace, Regent's Park, spinster, died 1896. Now, she leaves £4.5 to Walmesley. It's probably his money initially, but Walmesley applied to be the executor of the will, which was granted. Just take a quick sweet. Oh, stop lighting. Thanks to Pat and Will Sharp, who are doing the fantastic work on the churches of Wigan, for pointing this out. Because in the parish church at Wigan, there's a hidden window and a hidden memorial that Johnny Walmesley had paid for and put in 1899. The reason you can't go and see it is because it was decided that the organ and the housing and the ventilation for the organ would go into the Lee Chapel, which meant that it's covered the window and the memorial. So it was Pat and Will who said, you know, have you had a read of the ramble around the parish church? I said, yeah, it's on the website. I've read that. And it was by Verger, Walter John True, who came to Wigan from Wiltshire initially as the coachman to Nathaniel Eckersley at Standish Hall. So we've got basically describing what's happening in the window. I think it was just a random selection. I don't think it meant anything in respect to his father or even Johnny himself. So there's a bit of Latin that belongs to Mark chapter 10, verse 15, which basically says on the memorial, Amen, I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a child will not enter it. So moving on to Lydia Eve Powell. So this is the daughter from the out of wedlock girlfriend whose mother had died in 1896. Thankfully, Lydia went on to have quite a happy life, irrespective of the fact that she was born out of wedlock. And I was told by a surviving member of the Garrett family, which I'm going to go into, that back then she was receiving an awful lot of poison pen letters. So she became a bit of a dab hand at writing and stuff, basically calling her illegitimate, all the usual stuff. You shouldn't be where you are in society or in this position. So she became really, really good at just writing back and just having a bit of a do, you know. So thankfully, things worked out for Lydia Eve. So during the time that it's just her and her father, Johnny, and so I've got her born in Paddington, as we already know. The 1901 census, living with her father, Johnny, and grandmother, so that's John's mum, back at Lucknam Park. She became a highly accomplished horsewoman and given her hunt button by the Duke of Beaufort at the age of 16. Enjoyed expensive rounds of hunting meetings with her father in the south of England, and to quote Simon Garrett, in the pursuit of the inedible, he called it. Spent a great amount of time in France, so much so that she became fluent. And it was in 1909 by deed poll that Lydia Eve officially adopted the name Walmesley by deed poll. So it would be Lydia Eve Walmesley Powell. It's all men. So it's a bit of a like spot the difference, isn't it? So the Margaret Hamilton looking lady there is Lydia Eve. Now, she was always surrounded by men. This is a hunting party at Lucknam Park. So she was brought up with men, and that's all it ever was. And she's described as saying after the war, to when she got married and after the war, she described to her family that all the men that I went to school with, who I was brought up with, are all dead because of the First World War. So it's quite sad really. And you could lots of opinions out there about the justifications of that war. So in 1911, Lydia and Johnny are still moving around somewhat, and they're living at the Hotel Russell in London. In July of that year, Lydia married a Master of Cotton lecturer at Cambridge, Reginald Burnett Garrett in London, and they produced 6 children and settled in Bristol. Her father, Johnny, also remarried in the same parish, at the same church, in the same year, but in December, to the second wife, to a Belgian lady named Marie Bernard. Now, for anybody who likes doing family trees out there and stuff, when you start leaving this country and start looking at family trees in Belgium and stuff like that, it's difficult. So unfortunately, as you're going to see, I don't have a great amount of information on Marie, but she was well known at Lucknam Park Estate as being incredibly polite. And all the workers and all the staff had a lot of time for her, to be quite honest. So that's just an excerpt from the census. John Walmesley divorced with his daughter as well. So these are the marriages, as you can see. So the last quarter of 1911 in the same place at the same church. First Lydia Eve, who marries Garrett, and then we've got Johnny Walmesley marrying the Belgian lady, Marie Bernard. So we left the first wife who ended up divorcing Johnny for adultery and cruelty, get hold of Richard. And if you look at the date of death, you can probably guess what happened to Richard. So we're going to go into that just a little bit. So there's Richard, came from Violet and John or Johnny. And again, there's Lydia, as we've just covered, who happily married to Reginald. So, right. I might need to speak to you, Sean, later on about this, because I've done the geography on this. Born 21st of November 1890, 14 Norfolk Square, Paddington, London. Do you remember when I said Lydia Eve was living in Paddington at York Street? I'm fairly certain it's about a mile apart from each other. I reckon Walmesley probably knew this at some point, and I think he was skipping between the addresses. I genuinely believe he's probably been going back to Lydia. It's like, if I buy a house or rent an house here, then I can just go up that way, in the coach or whatever, and go up there. Can't prove it, but it just seems such a coincidence that he would be living at the time with his first wife and Richard, but yet the girl he really, really loved, Lydia, was living about a mile or even half a mile away in the same district. Unbelievable. I don't think there's any coincidence. So in 1901, he's studying at Wixenford School in Wokingham, which was obviously a private school. He was gazetted to the 3rd Battalion of the Yorkshire Regiment on the 13th of August 1910, being promoted lieutenant in May 1912. On the 1911 census, he is based at the infantry barracks in York. He was killed by sniper fire on the 20th of October 1914 at Ince, age 23, and buried at Aeroplane Cemetery in Belgium. Now, to give you an idea of war, it's not kicked off really, but you look at this dashing, handsome young man on the left, so the young man second right there, he looks like a totally different person in my opinion. And I would question whether the army have it right that is Richard, but I've had a good look at the other faces and I can't put anything close to it. But it just looks like his eyes are heavy. He just looks like he doesn't really want to be there. But unfortunately, that was taken earlier in that month of October, before he dies on October the 21st. So maybe 2 weeks previous to his death. So that paternal line is now finished for John Walmesley. So he's got the surviving daughter, but the bloodline, which was very important in these families, ended with the death of Richard, on the paternal side at least. So this is at Aeroplane Cemetery, Yorkshire Regiment, Lieutenant Richard Walmesley. And this is in Cologne. Do you know where I mentioned his father had the memorial with the column on it? So Richard's got the same, similar thing, Lieutenant Richard Walmesley. And then we've got different members of the army from Cologne as well, who had passed away. So this is where I don't really know very much about the second wife or how he met Marie Bernard. I don't know when she was born, but I know when she died. So as you can see, John Walmesley, second wife, Marie. Marie was born, ... I don't know. Married John Walmesley in 1911, as we've just discussed. And also we discussed as being described as a young Belgian who was very kind to Lydia Eve and apparently loved by the staff of the estate and household at Lucknam Park. Now, during the marriage, it appeared John had his intentions on settling in France and leaving England for good. So he's attempting to sell the Lucknam Park estate in 1918. But the property was unsold, although part of the estate was sold to ship owner Sir Alfred Reed. Reed was from Liverpool or Glasgow, it's one or the other, but he was basically a ship owner, shipbuilder, so he's got a few quid. Now, Johnny's state of mind and reasoning of wanting to leave England is probably described perfectly well here. As Johnny sold valuable works of art on the lawn at Lucknam Park before leaving England for good in 1918 to settle in France with Marie Bernard. And I mean, the adoration of the Magi, he gave his car to his chauffeur. He was flogging absolutely everything. So he didn't seem to want to take anything with him. And I wonder what happened to those portraits, especially of the Long family, who are his ancestors at the end of the day. So this is Lucknam Park, as you can see. It's now a health spa, but you'll need a good few quid to go and stay there for a couple of days. So in 1921, on the census, Sir Alfred Reed is described as a tenant with his wife and daughter Doris. There's another auction to actually sell Lucknam in 1923, still owned by Johnny Walmesley, and described as being completely renovated. And in 1924, Walmesley subscribed to a post office telephone for Lucknam. Third auction, 1925, advertising the telephone as a selling point, along with electric light and central heating. How much do we take for granted nowadays? But yet he's selling a fine English country manor with the main selling points that he's got a phone, electric light, and central heating. In 1926, Johnny in the newspaper is described as a former owner of Lucknam Park, assumedly sold, I'm assuming, in the 1925 auction to the then tenant, Sir Alfred Reed. Reed only kept hold of it for 3 years and sold it to a Scotch bloke soon after. Today, Lucknam is a 5-star country hotel with the Walmesley room available for hire. Now, he's married in 1911, but they divorced in 1925 while still living in France. I don't know why, but she did receive quarterly payments from the Walmesley estate as part of the marriage settlement before she passed away in 1931. And she also left some personal effects to her ex-husband, Johnny Walmesley, in her will. So I feel like they got off on good terms, but I'd like to know really why they were divorced. So that's we've had one lady out of wedlock, we've had 2 wives. So I hope you're still up to date because we're going on to the 3rd wife. So Princess Claudia Borzenko of Russia. This is where I said it would get quite interesting and the intrigue sort of kicks up somewhat here. So there's Johnny. He's a little bit young, he's a little bit older than Claudia. They both have something in common. They've both been divorced twice. So it's the 3rd and final sort of marriage for both of these people. That's the young Claudia, Princess Claudia Borzenko. And we'll move on to the Tsar in a minute. So just 1 year after his divorce to Marie Bernard, Johnny remarried on the 31st of March in 1926 in Paris at the age of 64 to Russian Princess Claudia Borzenko, aged 39. Claudia had been married twice previously to Michael Sedkov, and they had, that's wrong, there should be a couple, but there's one boy, which will pop up later on, that they had, and Nicholas Diavaranius, both of the Tsar's army. So they're both soldiers, and one of them was a confidential, very confidential aide, as they say, to the Tsar. Claudia was actually born in Tashkent on the 14th of June, 1886, to Sergei and Vera Borzenko. Today, Tashkent is the capital of Uzbekistan. Michael Segkov was a confidential assistant to King Nicholas II and suffered severe shell shock during World War I. The family believe that Claudia divorced Michael Segkov based on his invalidity, if you like, from World War I and his injuries, which don't seem very nice, really. And second husband, Nicholas D. Averanius, was a captain in the Russian Imperial Guard. Claudia had already left Russia before October 1917, and I've put in brackets, assumingly because of her husband's being a part of the Tsar's army. Now, we all know what was going on in Russia at that time. It was the Great Revolution of 1917 to 1923, which meant that Tsar Nicholas II voluntarily abdicated, and the family were imprisoned and assassinated on the 17th of July, 1918. Now, you think to yourself, why the children, but there's a well-known proverb about the wolf cub will grow into a wolf. So the revolution of 17 to 23 saw Russia abolish its monarchy and adopt a socialist form of government. Russia's involvement in World War I was ended as they later formed the Soviet Union, which, as we know, ran until 1991. Claudia actually wrote quite an early will in 1932 to provide annual incomes to ex-husband Nicholas, who was residing in France at the time and described as an invalid friend. So did she divorce the second husband because of his invalidity like the first? Quite possibly. And some of her immediate Russian family. Her husband Johnny was sixth in line. Assumingly, the will was written based upon Claudia's personal finances. So she's not in charge of the Walmesley estate. Johnny Walmesley is. Now, I do question the date on this because I did say that he was still with Marie Bernard. He supposedly with Marie and got divorced in 1925, but this is dated 1924, Johnny and Claudia, possibly on the Lucknam Park estate. Again, it's not the best photograph, but you see an aging Johnny Walmesley in his 60s here with his younger wife. And that's just a copy of the will. She wrote many wills, as did Johnny as well, kept on changing things around. Now, I called him a playboy in my article, and a descendant of Johnny told me off for that because she said he wasn't a playboy, he was a bohemian. So I think that's probably the right term, really, because he wasn't sort of going to the girls' burlesque. He wasn't doing anything like that. So he wasn't so much as a playboy, but I think bohemian's probably the right term to use. So he dies in 1937. I mean, that's some life, really. He was JP and High Sheriff of Wiltshire, just like his father at some point. And relating to Wigan, in a second, he agreed to sell land in Ince for a social housing development. It's land at Bushell's Farm. I don't know if there's any Inces in the room, but I don't know Ince very well. But it replaced the former Duke Street as well. So all this came up, and it's still there today. So the development that he sold to the council, the social housing, fill all of this area. And I've put him, I didn't even notice this the other day in brackets, no private railway. So Walmesley from the Wigan Wagon Works, which he owned, his private railway runs straight through the development. So I reckon the Wigan Wagon Works in the 20s are probably coming to an end. So he's developing all of this area. So he's given the council permission to do that. But whilst he's in France in the 20s and in the 30s, he didn't have any correspondence coming to him in France. He would come back to England from time to time to the Conservative Club and pick up his correspondence from there instead. He gifted land in 1926 at Cologne for the church at St. John the Baptist, which was duly consecrated by the Lord Bishop of the Diocese of Bristol, George Nixon. So he was flogging land off in the 20s already. I really like this one. This is interesting, especially this in a second. So in 1931, according to the papers, the Walmesley estate was earning £6,300 per year from property and minerals in Lancashire alone. That's £274,000 a year in today's money. So he's earning that in 1931, and that's an awful lot of money, and that's just Lancashire alone, notwithstanding other property in Wiltshire. 208,000 of the 274 came from Pearson and Knowles Coal and Iron Company. I mentioned the term coal again, all the money that they were taking from Pearson and Knowles. I'm not a big friend of Pearson and Knowles because of what they did to Ince. So all the flashes in Ince, Westwood, Turners, Pearsons, Scotsmans were all because of these guys, basically. They were taking out the Ince 4-foot seam, which is quite shallow, and the coal mining practices in the Victorian times were certainly not up to standard. So because the mining was quite shallow, that's why you've got all that, the flooding in Ince, if you like. So we know Johnny passed away in 1937. It was actually in Saint-Germain. He died smoking, according to the family, he died smoking one of his favourite cigars and told his stepson, Alexis, "You will see how an English gentleman dies." Surnamed by Bohemian, you know. Unfortunately, after he did die during the war, he had a villa on the south of France. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. It contained much artworks, including a Reynolds Lady in White on the left, and a Stubbs, who was well known for his paintings of horses that were stolen by the Nazis. I have tried to figure out what happened to them, whether they destroyed them, kept them, because there was a movement to get the artwork back, and there's still a movement today, so I don't know. Now, when I say about coincidences between the Hall of Ince Walmesley and those at Westwood House, Reynolds was a student to a fellow called Hudson. Hudson painted the lady who kept the Bonnie Prince at Walmesley House on Bishopgate in Wigan. So again, it shows how close these things are and these coincidences. Now, I love this because it's clearly written by Pearson and Knowles in 1929. In the twinkling of an eye, I always say in the old days, stuff used to get done, especially a lot quicker than it does today. This may express an impossible speed for removing one railway bridge and putting up another, but Pearson and Knowles have recently done the job without disturbing the railway's timetable. An old bridge of 25 feet span weighing 35 tons was taken away and replaced by a 54 feet span weighing 150 tons in the total time of 2 hours and 10 minutes. Now, I think you're dealing with steam cranes and stuff. Can you see these little things hanging on? I think these have probably been some straps for the cranes and stuff. But like I say, did they do it in 2 hours, 10 minutes, or are they posturing and telling you how good they are? I don't know, but I wouldn't put it past them. But like I say, stuff used to get done. And I think that's a fantastic advert. That's on Grace's Guard if you've not been on the website. It's fantastic as Grace's. Now, the Bohemian Johnny Walmesley, I don't know what happened here. He died in 1937, but his ashes only came back to England in 1949. And sadly, again, this is the life that you live. According to a former vicar at St. John in Cologne, he represents a sagging cardboard box tied with string, situated on the shelf above his father in the family vault at Cologne. It's quite sad, really. So when he died, who did he leave the rest of the estate to? Well, he left 3/4 to his surviving wife, the Russian Princess Claudia, and 1/4 to her sister Vera. Now, I think Vera stayed in tow with Claudia till the end of her life, pretty much. So they stayed very close. And thankfully, out of the trust as well, notwithstanding Lydia's family that are still around today down in Bristol, the Garretts were paid an annual figure from the will until the recent demise of Richard Garrett in 2021. What's interesting about Richard Garrett dying in 2021 is they put him in the vault at Cologne. So the vault, whilst it's not accepting Walmesley because there's none left anymore, it's still accepting the Garretts. So they're still using the vault for their purposes. And I figured that the trustees of the estate sold the vicarage on Westwood Lane, which was just down here, to the Ince Burial Board in 1952, who laid out the new Westwood Cemetery. So it ran straight down to where the line was. But it's quite a small patch, but it's quite a nice cemetery. If you like the cemeteries, I don't mind them. So I mentioned that one boy from Claudia's first husband. There was actually 2 daughters as well. There was a boy, Alexis, a Russian boy. And I'll talk about him quite briefly. Now, Alexis was born in 1903, and you think, wow, his wife's still around. Well, it's his wife, or ex-wife, if you like, widow, who gave me a great amount of information on the link to the Russians. And she basically made me laugh. She said, to put your mental arithmetic at rest, I was quite a deal younger than Alexis. And I'd already figured that out already. But it turns out that they both met teaching at the girls' grammar school down in Cornwall. So you see Michael Walmesley here. So this is after Alexis takes the Walmesley name. This is in the in the time of Johnny's life, but it's the Russian Walmsleys, if you like. It's not the English Walmsleys. However, one child once again with Michelle. And Michelle was a French lady who now lives in Australia. And recently, as in last Friday, the son of Alexis sent me these fantastic photographs and some good information about Alexis as well. So he was born in Vilna in Russia, which is now the capital of Lithuania, in 1903. It was his Auntie Vera that managed to get him out of Russia in the early 20s. And in brackets, I asked the question, was it the end of the Russian Revolution in 1923? He's wearing military attire. He's 15 years of age. So it's about, about 1915, something like that. The maths are wrong, but however. But you're linked to the Tsar. You're seen as a link to the Tsar. The Bolsheviks just wouldn't have it. So they got him out of there quick time and came back to France and to see his mother Claudia and his stepfather Johnny. So he's living in Paris up until at least 1938 and settled in England with his mother. This guy must have really, really good timing because, as we know, France would become occupied during the Second World War by German forces. So Alexis actually changed his name by default during World War II and naturalised officially by certificate on the 17th of Feb 1948. Awarded his pilot's licence on June the 21st, 1949, and a certificate in hang gliding 10 years later. So he's fitting a lot of stuff in, really, considering he gets to a certain age. So he marries in 1963 and settled in Cornwall with his wife and son. His mother, Claudia, kept the first floor. So Claudia, again, is a widow. John is long gone. The family, or Michelle tells me that Claudia stuck like glue to her son, Alexis. So there was a bit of friction naturally between Claudia and the wife of Alexis, Michelle. Alexis actually passed away June 1973 in Cornwall and he's buried at Penzance Cemetery. So this is him as a young man. This is him getting his pilot's licence. You can notice Alexis Walmesley. So he's dropped the Sedkoff as he was originally. Here he is in older age, just leaning on this bit of a picket fence or gate. And he's the guy doing his lessons. He's at the rear of this plane. And as his son told me, he said, "Don't you worry about it. My dad crashed a good few planes," is what he said. So all good things come to an end. And the last of the link was probably Claudia Walmesley in 1969. However, I can't really tell you as much as what I've already told you, apart from the fact that she settled in an old people's home and passed away in a place called Moose Hall in Cornwall. Buried at this place in Paul Parish Church. Her sister Vera died in 1976. So it was after the demise, if you like, in Cornwall, when Michelle and her son Michael would go and settle in Australia. Just to test you. Remember Lady Reeve Garrett? The first relationship of Johnny? But she settled happily ever after, but one of her sons became quite famous. So her husband, Reginald Garrett, actually passed away in June 1959 in Kingswood near Bristol. The family also made a small private income from the wine trade. It is worth noting that the second son, James Garrett, worked at British Transport Films and worked on Train Time in 1952, and This Is York in 1953. Does anyone remember those adverts? God, you're not as old as thing, isn't it? Described in the media as one of the great names in British television commercial making. He was drafted in during the Heath government. Heath was before my time. But apparently Heath was struggling with an image problem. So they brought this guy in to sort of bump him up a bit, give him the right publicity. I might be speaking out of turn, but I think if you want to be the Prime Minister of the country, you've got an image problem, you probably shouldn't be there. But anyway, so this was the fellow, highly regarded, highly respected, and Lydia died in Bristol in 1970. So we're going to start summing up somewhat now. Have I got this right? Yes. So the descendants of Johnny, the English side, are in blue. Now, the Russian side are in red. You see what I've done now? So currently, Simon Garrett is living. I've been swapping emails with Simon. He's been telling me loads about Johnny Walmesley. So Simon comes from that Lydia Eve, that lady out of wedlock. Then we've got Alexis, Michael Walmesley Sedkoff. died in 73. Charles Michael Walmesley, now living over in Australia in Adelaide. I had a fantastic chat with him live on the internet last Sunday. My best description was, I was expecting the guy to come on, look like a lawyer in a tweed jacket, all the usual stuff. I thought, I bet he's got a few quid of it. He's as normal as me and you. He was having a joke, having a laugh, and all this. He was a fantastic bloke. So this gentleman is technically from the Russian stock, but by name, he still carries the Walmesley badge. Now, he sent me a really interesting picture. Now, on the left is the wax impression of a signet ring. Michael wears this ring. It belonged to Johnny Walmesley. That's the direct translation of this Latin is ancestors hope lasts, or according to Furburne's Book of Crests in 1905, it meant the hope of my ancestors endures. And there is one lasting piece of evidence in Ince and the old town hall. It's now a children's play thing, children's creche. And I didn't notice until the other week, above the door there, that's the lion from the Walmesley crest. All the Walmesleys in Lancashire use the lion. They would only usually change the motto in some way, shape or form. So that, to me, is the last testament of this branch of the Walmesleys in Ince. Thank you very much.